Okay, good morning everybody, and welcome to a lovely San Francisco Wednesday morning. Thanks for coming in so early. I know this is a great place to hang out before the bagels arrive. So as penance for that, you have to sit through us talking. But we do appreciate people turning up this early. I think it took Winston around 2 hours to get in this morning. The traffic was so bad, so we're lucky to have him. But there we go. Just to introduce myself, my name's Duncan Mills. I work in the development team, tools team at Oracle, looking after our IDEs, frameworks, and Hudson's part of that overall mission. And are you switched on, Winston?
Hello.
Yes. This is Winston Cash. So Winston's the project lead on Hudson at the Eclipse Foundation, and really the powerhouse behind moving Hudson forward. My role on the project is more, like as I put it here, project gopher. So I deal with the uninteresting stuff, like legal and so on. Okay, so developing best practices, or really as we can put it, towards developing best practice. This is one of these areas where there's no right and wrong solution. And if we start out with the assumption that we know it all and we know how to do everything correctly from the start, then we're not going to really have a very successful time of it. So we have to acknowledge that this area, as in any field of software engineering, best practices are something that change. They're very dependent on your environment and what you're doing. But what we try to do in this presentation is kind of pull together some of the core good practices that we've seen, particularly with some of our work with the Eclipse Foundation, and try and at least distill those into a working document, let's put it that way. Right? We have to assume this is going to change. So before we get into that section, which Winston will be in charge of because it's more his area, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about where Hudson is at the moment, just in case you were unsure of where we were in the life cycle. Just have some consideration about what continuous integration really means beyond the way we might think of it today, and then we'll get into the best practice side, because those two things are actually very closely aligned. So a little bit about Hudson. Hudson itself is in a state of migration at the moment. We're moving from being a Java.NET project hosted through the HudsonCI.org website onto what we call a hybrid project. And that will mean that Hudson is actually kind of co-hosted. So Hudson Core, the actual core engine that does the majority of the scheduling work, is actually an Eclipse Foundation project. But the plugins, for various reasons, which I'll explain in a second, are mostly outside of Eclipse. To drill down on that, the reason there is mostly around IP concerns, library approvals, and so on, and of course the fact that it can be a more onerous process to commit code into Eclipse based on their procedures and so on. And a lot of plugin writers don't want to go through that rigmarole. So we've tried to make it nice and easy so that you can keep your plugins on GitHub or indeed wherever else you want, and still have those, of course, as part of the ecosystem. So going forward from from Hudson 3.0, there'll be this kind of dual license situation where Hudson Core is Eclipse licensed, and then by default, plugins will continue to be MIT licensed unless their authors specify otherwise. In terms of the versions that are out there right now, so 2.2.1 is the official production version of Hudson. As you'll see, we're very close now to the Hudson 3.0 release from the Eclipse Foundation, which will become the next production version, hopefully within 3 weeks or so, we're hoping, if all goes well. There's a few little things we need to do just to get the approvals through and go through the final release process with the Eclipse Foundation, but we're just about there. And I'll explain in a second a little bit about what we've been doing in that migration across to Eclipse, because it's taken a lot longer than you would imagine, but I'll explain why. So at Eclipse itself, we're a top-level project under their technology area, so it's not... Some folks have been a little bit confused this week, and they say, well, if you're in Eclipse, do I have to download the IDE to get Hudson? No. The Eclipse Foundation is an open source environment with all of the facilities, but that doesn't mean that we're bundled with Eclipse, the IDE. You can download and use the WAR file as you always have, or the other distributables. So no real difference there. So quickly, if you're not familiar with Hudson, you know, what we've tried to do and what Koshke originally did when he came up with this brilliant idea was have something that was really easy and simple to use. Have I got the, yes, the Eclipse Foundation stuff's on the next page. So, you know, the idea is that we can get going from 0 to hero, if you like, within a few minutes, as long as it takes to run the war file, and you can start to build these very complex integration and CI projects and manage it in a simple way. I'm trusting you, let me just check, is everyone here actually familiar with Hudson before I start? Or at least, yeah. That's somewhat of a relief. I'll say it's not a bad room to wait for the bagels in, but there we go. So I won't tell you what Hudson is, because you know that. So in Hudson 3, what have we been doing? So the major job has actually been what we call the IP cleanup. We always knew this would be a consideration and a possible problem moving to Eclipse. The Eclipse Foundation has very strict guidelines and processes for ensuring that the code base that's in and hosted on Eclipse is, from an IP perspective, clean. So people can, with confidence, use that code. They know exactly, there's traceability, if you like. We know exactly every developer who's touched every line. That's the idea. So this extends to all of the libraries that are used downstream by a particular piece of code. Now, this turned out to be a real challenge in the case of Hudson, because just because of its nature and the nature of the kind of plugin ecosystem and so on, and the way that over time Hudson Core had been kind of had stuff added on to help downstream plugins, we ended up with an awful lot of downstream dependencies, which all had to be worked through. Right? And many of those, from an IP perspective or from a license perspective, were not acceptable to the Eclipse Foundation. And rightly so. Right? They do this stuff to protect them and to protect you. That's the whole idea. So just to give you an idea, Hudson Core, if you compare 2.2 with 3, we've dropped down from a 63 megabyte core to 24 megabytes, so that's the download, and reduced the number of jar files by around 20, and considerably changed the jar files as well. So we've taken the opportunity here to actually upgrade a bunch of stuff where very old versions had been used in the past, so we've upgraded where we can to the more recent versions of those open source libraries. As I've mentioned, in some cases, such as in the case of JFreechart and Winstone, we've actually had to wholesale replace those with alternative implementations. Other places, like we had a dependency on Jackson and Zom, which for various reasons were incompatible from a license perspective, so we actually had to write some extra code of our own to plug that gap. So there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work that's happened, which isn't very glamorous, and doesn't really seem to move Hudson on from the perspective of the consuming user, but the reality is that we've ended up with a good, stable, and good quality core. Okay. There are some new features in Hudson 3, but there's a lot more to come. We've got great plans, and if you want to join the community meetings, you can get to those from the Hudson Wiki on Eclipse. Every 2 weeks we have a community meeting and discuss, what's coming next. And we're getting to the stage now that 3.0 is just about put to bed. We can start looking at what we're going to do in the next 2 or 3 releases. We've already got some plans. So the things we have put in, very important one in there is the ability to have switchable update centers. This is really of key interest to people who are trying to run up private or public clouds, where they want to use Hudson as part of their hosting solution, but they want to limit the plugins that people can be running inside that Hudson instance. So the pluggable update center allows you to do that and constrain things. And there's been a whole load of changes around the way plugins are managed, and the whole system is bootstrapped, mainly to do with the library reorganization and the IP cleanup. Anyway, enough about that. Let's move on to the real content. What does CI really mean? And I think this is something we have to think about rather carefully, because it does feed into some of the conflicting demands on the CI system, and in turn some of the requirements for the best practices you have to worry about. We've got a whole community of people who are interested in CI. In most cases, the instigating factor in any organization is going to be, one of these groups has a particular interest and dives in and starts using Hudson. Usually it's the developers because it just makes their life easier, right? Or it may be the QA folks, or it may be the build engineers. It doesn't really matter, but we tend to get an initial island within an organization of people who are interested in just making my day-to-day life easier, but then the use becomes more pervasive and you start getting more stakeholders. And that has an interesting effect because it does mean there is a different set of requirements as far as managing that Hudson instance and the best practices around it, right? So as a developer who's just running, a small Hudson farm to build for a couple of different platforms maybe, I don't mind if I have to shut that down and bring it up and, occasionally interfere with the thing. But from a management perspective, if they're suddenly starting to use Hudson as a key part of their reporting infrastructure and their, I want to check who's done the most check-ins this week or who's fixed the most bugs or who's got the best code quality, it goes from being a handy utility that developers just use to make their life easier to being part of the infrastructure that suddenly has to be supported, maintained, and available when that management team wants it. And that really changes the nature, and that has a knock-on effect. So we have to think about all of these constituents, if you like, and how what we do with our Hudson instances will affect those. And it's a matter of the kind of conflicting needs of those groups. From the development point of view, I want something that's going to make my job easier so I can check in, run the basic sanity tests, maybe deploy that thing into my test instance depending on what I'm building, and that's all I need. That's all I care about. From the QA point of view, well, those guys may well want to be running a full regression on every check-in, right? Those are often very conflicting things because a full regression test may take way too long compared with what I want as a developer. So we can start to see how conflicts creep in to the requirements of the CI system. But we're obviously all wanting to have faster development processes and better visibility into the results of those processes. But sometimes we get conflicts. And the point is, of course, that you just have to start looking at your CI system as something more than just a build tool and start using it in multiple ways. And don't try and do everything in one go. And that's one of the things we'll come on to later. So, of course, Hudson's an ideal backbone for this. And this is why you're beginning to see this kind of CI engine as a core part of people's cloud development strategies. This week, we at Oracle announced our cloud developer, Oracle Cloud Development Service in preview, and that's using Hudson at its core, both for the back-end provisioning, but also as a service within that developer service. Okay, so we know Hudson's got all the right bits. That's why we like it, right? The fact that it's so extensible with plugins. If you are doing something slightly exotic in your organization, and not everyone's the same. A lot of us do use standardized tools and capabilities, but pretty much every organization has their own extra bits they do, whether it's custom scripts they need to run or custom processes they need to employ. Of course, you can plug those things in. And I think we're finding that when we look at the plugin usage, some of the most popular plugins are in fact nothing to do with building and source control. They're all to do with code analysis and quality and that kind of stuff. And that's quite interesting. It's really an indication, if you like, of how Hudson has moved beyond just being this build utility to make developers' lives easier into something that's suddenly of interest to management, because they can get visibility into this code quality, for example. I think this is a great quote. So Jared Davidson, who's a long-suffering Hudson user, he actually runs the build farm for Oracle JDeveloper, the Oracle Java IDE, or rather one of the Oracle IDEs, there are many IDEs. And he runs a huge farm of servers managing all of the cross-platform, cross-JDK builds. So he's got the world's best matrix builds. You wouldn't believe it. But he made this very pertinent point, right, that one of the problems with Hudson is the fact that in some ways it's too easy to set up. And this is where we really lead into some of the really common mistakes we see and problems that people come up with. Because it's so easy to get Hudson up and running that by stealth it can just creep in and become a critical part of your build infrastructure without you even realizing it. Yeah. It's running on the spare Linux box under the desk, or it's running on the obscure VM that someone put up and they can't quite remember where it is, but it's going fine. And so we can end up in this situation that you're beginning to depend on infrastructure that really isn't properly maintained in the IT sense. And if you've just done all the default stuff, not only that it's potentially a huge security hole. A lot of organizations, rightly so, care about things like how visible their source code is across their organization. You know, though, of course, Hudson's very widely used in the open source community, and we're quite happy, for example, on Hudson CI or on the Eclipse Foundation, everyone can see our Hudson builds happening. That's absolutely fine. Everyone can check out our source code. That's fine. That's not quite the same way that other organizations might see it. So we have to be aware of that particular issue. So with that long pre-ramble, apologies for that, but I thought it'd be useful just to fill you in on where we are and where we're going. I want to hand over to Winston to actually give you some meat and get you through some of the best practices that we've kind of creamed from the top of the community and some of the things we've learned with some of the tuning work we've done recently. The clicker, sir.
Good morning.
Let's just go a little bit higher. Right.
Okay, can you hear me properly? Okay. So I thought that Duncan is going to talk the whole thing because he has a very good English accent, so I don't. But he said, no, you have to talk, so I thought, okay, I'll go through that. So I hope Duncan will just jump in and
I'll make witty and incisive comments into the presentation.
Yeah. So my favorite topic to usually talk is about plugin development. Since I wanted more people to write plugins for that, I have written a lot of articles and I spend a lot of time teaching people how to write plugins. But I noticed that I get about 2 to 3 emails every day asking me about, oh, Hudson is slow, Hudson is not doing what I want to do. How do I make it work properly for me? So that's what I thought that, okay, I should keep aside the talking about plugin for a while and talk about best practices. So a few months ago, we happened to work with Eclipse Foundation. So the Eclipse Foundation webmasters, Matt and Dennis, they called me and said that, you know, we have a big problem at Eclipse. It's slow. Can you take a look at it? So I told him that next time the Hudson is going to grinding down, don't do anything, just send me an email. I'm going to get the heap dump and I'm going to analyze that. So I analyzed about 2 GB per heap, about 10 GB to 12 GB analyzed, and I found out that it's so simple. I mean, if you do the things in a very simple way and put Hudson to work in a proper way, you get more productive Hudson. So that's what I thought that we'll just put together. And
yeah, it was very much kind of the triggering thing that made us think about doing this presentation. So just while Winston was talking there, I got up. This is actually the live build farm at Hudson. Sorry, at Eclipse.
Eclipse, yeah.
So they run a huge number of jobs. You can see. Oh yeah, I'm just looking at the repository aggregation.
So Eclipse has about 450 jobs, and they have about 9 to 10 slaves, and it is continuously. It's continuously building throughout the day, and especially when there's a release like Juno or something like that, it was growing crazy. I think it was the right time for me to look into that. So that's when I look at that. So let's go back to the slides.
Yeah, sure. Okay, we talked about that. Yeah. Or you can talk to that one.
Yeah.
We've got the Eclipse slide later on. So
when we talk about the best practices for Hudson, we actually need to look at what are the stakeholders of Hudson. So we thought that the best way to look at is divide the real users of Hudson or the maintainers of Hudson. So we thought that we should look into the developer point of view, a product or project manager point of view, and or E point of view, that's a build engineer. So it's all these 3 people have to come together and do it correctly. If you are not doing that correctly, then you are going to have a system which is unstable and it's not doing the things. So the very first thing we need to talk about is are we using Hudson as a real CI system? So briefly he talked about what is a CI system. As an example, I happened to talk to one of the engineers from Oracle. She came to me and said that I'm going to buy you a lunch if you fix this for me. So I asked her, what is exactly the problem? She told that I'm using Matrix build, and it takes about 9 hours to finish. So after 9 hours to finish, if there is a problem, and if the build is breaking, then I have to restart the whole thing. Then I said, are you kidding me? It takes 9 hours to build? Is that the way how you use the CI system? And she was very upset, and I never got the lunch after that. So what I told her is, you need to follow what a CI is. I told her that there are 2 books which I highly recommend for everyone to read. One is the Test-Driven Development, and other one is the Continuous Integration by Paul Duell. These 2 books very clearly explain what a CI is. So very first thing, how many of you build a system, build a job which runs more than 10 minutes?
Who's going to admit to it? Yeah, little hands are creeping up. Yeah.
According to the Martin Fowler, if your job is taking more than 10 minutes, then you're not doing real CI. Continuous integration must be done within 10 minutes. But you can say that my project is so big, how can I make it to build it within 10 minutes? That is exactly what they talk about. You have to architect your build. Just like how you architect your software, you have to architect your build system also. You have to reduce into what you call as buildable chunks.
And this is really where you get this conflict, as I mentioned earlier, between the build engineers who want to build the deployable product to hand on to someone else, and the needs of the developers, which we're talking about here, which is just this really fast turnaround. And so we want to look at, well, maybe not try and do everything with one build. Let's split it up. We have the builds that get triggered by the check-ins, which are within this 10-minute boundary, and they just do the relevant smoke tests or enough regression sanity stuff to make sure that at least you stand less chance of breaking the world and you've caught the obvious things. And then sure, if the build engineer wants to have his full regression suite running and building on 5 different platforms happening, he can do that overnight, right? Just create another job for that, and do it that way. And I think this is a mistake a lot of people fall into.
So the continuous integration build should, if there is a failure, it should fail within 10 minutes, and the notification should be sent to the corresponding people. So there's a lot of ways to do that, like email, Jabber, RSS, even lava lamps. And I don't mind if you hook it up with your fire alarm also. So anyway, so find the correct identity from your VCS, send the email to the corresponding person.
Send an email to their boss.
To the person who broke it, and then just fix it. I remember we used to have a jar where you had to put $1 every time you break the build, and at the end of the week we have enough money to buy beers. So I mean, we have come a long way from that, of that manually doing everything, and right now Hudson is doing the things, but make sure that what you do, the builds are doing the right way.
Okay.
Next slide.
There we go.
Okay, so as I said, you have to break your jobs into so many things. So what happened when you do that? So you ended up with happening large number of jobs. So when you have a large number of jobs, there is a maintenance overhead, because the same job and the same properties and same thing may be repeating in several number of jobs when you break up. That is the reason why there's a lot of people who are asking about the cascading job, how I can inherit a lot of things from my previous job to that one. This is why we introduced the concept of cascading jobs in 2.2.0. And of course, we are not saying that it's doing everything, but it does a lot of things, and it reduces the overall maintenance by, I would at least say, 50%. So really try this if you're not using it anymore.
Because you look at a lot of jobs and there's so much duplication that doesn't need to be there, and of course that's more maintenance. You have to make one change, you've got to go and make that change across the farm in all the different similar jobs. So having this kind of templated approach is a huge productivity boost.
Yes.
Okay.
Next
Right.
So
I'm going to be your clicker boy. It's like, pretend Winston is Larry Ellison and I'm the person who says click to. There we go. I told you I was the gopher.
We just talked about this. Again, there are a lot of plugins which help you to identify what are my job structures and what is that. So we are not going to talk about all the plugins with that, but I can talk about a couple of plugins. One is, I really like the build pipeline, which is actually show you the downstream job builds and upstream job builds, and gives a very good idea about what builds are breaking things. As I said, when you are trying to break your job into so many different jobs, then it is hard to find that which job is breaking the whole, the tree of that one. So there are plugins which is actually allow you to view that. One is the build pipeline plugin and the downstream view plugin. These things will give you a good idea about how to look at that. So as I said, simpler job is better. So keep your job simple and make it to build fast and fail fast.
Yeah, better to have more jobs linked together than huge jobs that you can't debug.
Yes.
Just out of interest, I mean, this is one area where when we look forward to what we're going to do beyond Hudson 3.0.0, this whole area of making these workflows, these complex job trees, easier to handle in core is certainly an area we want to look at. So if you've got any ideas, we'll be always pleased to hear them. Okay.
Job management. You all know that. When it comes to, I think again I should talk about this example. I got an email, a panicky email, saying that, oh, we upgraded Hudson version, now everything is broken, and our production is halted. So we came back and said that, why don't you just take it from the backup? They said, oh, we didn't back up the whole thing. Then I think that because of that, I think this product, what I'm talking about, is one of the very, very important product within Oracle. I don't want to say what product exactly, except that it is installed in millions of computers in the whole world. So then because of this, the whole production was stopped for almost a week because they did not back up the things whole. So as much as possible, try to back up the things, and there are plugins which is helping you to do that.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing we wanted to make here, and I think this was a great piece of advice that actually, I'm trying to remember who gave us, maybe Manfred, but anyway, there's a temptation as well when you're building Hudson jobs to the fact that you can have multiple steps within the job. People try and start to use it almost like a scripting language, right? So they have these big multi-step jobs. And that's fine, but then you're kind of using Hudson almost as a scripting, a programming tool almost. And the problem there is you end up with even with the templated jobs and so on, you can end up with a situation where you've got really too much logic and too many steps tied up in the build processes themselves. So it absolutely makes sense when you're looking at doing a piece of work in a job, well, how much of that can I actually put in some kind of external script? Now, whether that's Maven, whether that's Ant, or whether it's shell script, something that can be parameterized, reused again and again. I mean, a lot of us will build very many similar things, and if we can encapsulate that into some kind of script that's parameterized, that then just gets wired up to a very simple job, that fulfills Winston's desire for short, simple jobs. It also helps with this whole backup thing because you just check those scripts into source control. We'll talk about backing up Hudson itself in a minute, but specifically we're thinking about the scripts here. So it's a great idea to think about how you externalize the logic, and obviously doing that in a standardized way. So one project isn't using AND, another one's using shell script, whatever.
Another point is that naming the job. This may looks very simple, but believe me, when I was talking to some people and asking them what is the what is that, what do you call, corresponding jobs corresponding to that, then they go and start and search on that one. So give a good, clear name starting with certain prefix so that you can easily search, or you can create a view with that one. Though this is a very simple thing, believe me, it goes a long way when you try to find that.
And if we just pop back to the Eclipse Foundation as a good example, you know, they're using a very well-organized scheme here, and you can see it at the back, but you know, all the different subparts of Eclipse are nicely separated into views. So, you know, you're not interested in the entire Eclipse Foundation from the point of view of being a committer. You know, we care about Hudson, and if Jetty's building, I don't really care. So, you know, just using views and making it easy to use views in the sense of, as we have here, in pretty much every case, the jobs are well named, so we can just use Hudson as a regular expression, and we don't even have to name each individual job. So if Winston adds a new job to the build, as long as he calls it the right thing, it's going to appear in that view without any further thought. So it's just a little thing, but it's a great idea. Okay, so let's move on. So yeah, let me talk about this one. So this kind of highlights back to that comment that J.R.R. Davidson made to me, which is, you know, we tend to start using CI by stealth and suddenly wake up one morning and find that it's bitten us in the backside. The system goes down, you haven't got a backup for it, right? I mean, exactly the kind of scenario. And so you need to be thinking about CI in terms of being a production service to your development organizations. Or, of course, you can go to a cloud vendor and get that same level of service, hopefully. But you need to think of the builds themselves as valuable data. They're valuable metadata that you need to own and control, so you don't have to spend a week trying to rebuild all your jobs if you can remember even what they were all doing, right? So it's very important that the metadata is managed, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second, that you invest the right resources into it. Certainly the tendency is for, because we start out small, you know, you might have a small set of Hudson slaves running on the odd machines you've got lying about, or on other developers' boxes, or, you know, these kind of informal networks where, again, because we've started from making a developer's life easier or making a team's life easier, you're then in a scenario where there's no management of that infrastructure. Yeah. So, you know, when a developer inadvertently removes that virtual box, you've suddenly lost one of your slaves or even your master. So that kind of stuff can be a real issue. So these CI installations have to be resourced properly, right? And there are various things that we can do around the infrastructure to make life a little bit easier. And we'll talk about some of these as we go through. So metadata, first of all, as I said, this is a valuable part of the business, right? As we can see, it's fine. If I'm just building a little solo, let's say I'm building a plugin for Hudson, right, which I am at the moment with Winston's help. Yeah, I've got a Hudson job building that. If it gets blown away, I lose the Hudson instance, it's not the end of the world. It will take me about 2 minutes to recreate the job, right? Because in fact, most of the work is done by the checked-in scripts. So I'm following our own best practice there. But if we can imagine the impact, say at the Eclipse Foundation, if we lost the descriptions of all of those jobs, that would be a huge, huge effort to reinstate those. As I said, in many cases, you might not even realize what they were all doing. So you've got to treat the Hudson metadata like a valuable asset that needs to be backed up and managed properly. There are, as Winston said, some plugins to help you with this. There's the backup plugin and the thin backup plugin. But, you know, just treat the whole environment as something you can back up and restore instantly. And, of course, test it. Yeah. Don't just use the thin backup plugin and assume it's working. Yeah. Actually test it. That's trivial stuff. We should all be doing this, but it's amazing that it doesn't happen all the time, right? Yeah. So treat it like a production system. There's another very useful plugin, the Job Config History plugin. If you're in a scenario where you have got multiple users who are all privileged to start playing around with the configuration of jobs, then yeah, at least get an audit trail of what's happened there and work out who it was that put that step in or changed that particular thing. Okay. So resource management. This is a lot of the stuff we learned from Eclipse. So I'll let Hudson quickly.
Oh, yeah.
I always call Winston Hudson. It's terrible.
Yeah. Just before going into this, I wanted to talk about. Are we going to talk about the upgrade later?
Yeah, with some.
Okay. So yeah, if you are upgrading, when you are talking about backup, so we always recommend that if you are upgrading your Hudson, even if it is a plugin, don't do it on the production environment. This is what it happened. The JDK team, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to tell the team. They were down for a week because they just upgraded a plugin and which they broke the whole thing. They didn't have the backup and they were halted for almost a week. So don't do your upgrade in your production system if your system is really what do you call mission critical system for you.
Yeah, you don't upgrade your email system in place. You have a test environment, you make sure all of your email gets into it and so on. It's the same process here, right?
So Eclipse Foundation has an excellent way of doing that. Can you show the sandbox? So they have created...
So yeah, here's the sandbox.
This is a sandbox, and right now they are running Hudson 3.0 on this machine, and they are giving me constant feedback, what is breaking, what is not breaking, and I'm trying to fix in Hudson 3.0 as much as possible. As I said, we changed a lot in Hudson 3.0. Literally, we rip apart the whole thing and put it back, changing a lot of libraries, and also things are breaking. And because this Eclipse Foundation is running that in their sandbox, I'm able to get a lot of feedbacks, and they are also able to test it. So if you don't have one, create a sandbox and upgrade it only after you're fully satisfied. That is there. So this upgrade, you can just copy your entire home folder and you can just test it on that one. But make sure if you're using a slave, go modify the slave and use a different home for the slave. Otherwise, you are going to mix up with a slave home folder. So that's very important when you're doing that.
And a quick appeal here, we're in the process of testing as many old versions as we can through the QA team. So if you have a set of old builds, so if you're running on Hudson 1, for example, we'd be really interested in having those build scripts so we can actually try and migrate them up to 3 and see what happens. Yeah. So I've actually already spoken to a few people on the demo grounds, but if you'd like to help out, we'd just love to have your scripts and give them a go, because people have just used this stuff in so many different ways, you can never predict exactly what's going to happen. So we do our best on the testing, but do it in sandbox first.
One of the issues is when you are upgrading to a new version, and if if some older plugins are there, and those plugins might break the Hudson, and Hudson may not start. So in 3.0, we come up with the idea of a bootstrap mechanism. So when you actually install and you start the Hudson for the first time, you get a nice UI and asking you to tell that, okay, all these plugins are outdated. You need to update this plugin for this version to work. So either you can just uninstall or you can just install the new plugins.
So it's a bit more kind of upfront warning of where there might be problems rather than you just trying to bring up the instance and it all not working. Okay. So just a little bit here on resource usage. So again, based on a lot of scenarios we've been seeing, right, the number of builds you keep is certainly a big factor as to what the resource requirements are on the system. So restricting the history depth is a good idea in terms of just restricting the amount of memory that you're using at any one time. And that's often the cause we see of slow systems. It's nothing to do with the environment they're physically running on or the amount of memory that's allocated to the JVM. It's just the fact that they're having to manipulate such large structures in memory, and we can really cut back on this. Right?
Yeah, my analysis of the heap at Eclipse Foundation has given me a good idea about how though I think we can improve a lot of the efficiency by using these best practices, we still found that the data model of Hudson is inefficient in certain area, which we are planning to improve in the next release, and not in 3.0, but in the version after that.
3.01 or whatever. Yeah. Okay. So let's move on. So the other, we just wanted to mention it here. I think apart from the slow performance aspect, the kind of number one cause of systems failing is just as simple as disk space, right? Again, because people aren't managing their CI environments as production environments, and things fill up because they're keeping thousands of old builds, thousands of build artifacts, never cleaning it up. The disk fills up, and of course, all hell breaks loose. So again, it's a silly thing, but it happens, right?
Yeah, and one example, again, I bring it from Eclipse Foundation. Eclipse Foundation has an NFS setup, and what happened is this NFS was filled up, and this NFS was mounted on all the different slaves, and this caused the entire system to crash. So the best practice is, again, to have a script which goes through your jobs, builds jobs, and tries to find out which user is using more amount and set a fixed amount and send an email. Eclipse Foundation is doing that. So every often I get an email saying that your workspace is beyond 1 GB, so please try to adjust it and keep it less than 1 GB. I think that's a good practice. I mean, if a particular user is trying to take away all the space, it makes sense to find who is using the space. It's a very simple script using Python or user shell script. Just try to find out the amount of memory used by the different people, send an email. So I think that's the best practice.
Yeah. So this is kind of just a summary of the stuff that we learned, if you like, whilst looking at the Eclipse scenario. We kind of talked about most of these. So keeping the number of builds restricted, just promoting those artifacts you actually want to keep rather than every intermediate regression test result or whatever. Managing the amount of information that's going out into the log files, again, just purely from the disk space perspective, right? And of course, making sure that you are both backing up your metadata and then also using the relevant plugins like the Copy Artifacts plugin to move those big artifacts like EAR files or builds of Eclipse IDE in this case off onto some other separate managed storage. So your build server isn't also your download server, for example.
Yeah.
Could be a problem if you're a large site like this.
I thought I should talk about this manage artifacts externally. There's, again, another best practice. We thought that everybody should follow that. So again, the same issue came from Eclipse Foundation. One day I got an email saying that suddenly the Hudson is running very slow. So I just did a thread dump, and I saw that about like 93 or more than 93 threads are just serving data. I mean, it's file serving to somebody. So then I asked somebody, if anybody is downloading a lot of data from that. Then somebody raised their hand and said, yes, I just say curl, and I started downloading a lot of workspace data from the web page. So please don't use Hudson as a file server. Please keep it as a execution thing. If you want to download, you keep all your artifacts externally. So I mean, there's one more slide which is explain how you can do that. We'll talk about it later.
We'll talk about that,
yeah.
Okay, so security, I mean, this again is something that Gerard raised in his comment. The stealth acquisition of CI through someone just installing it. You've then suddenly got this open window into your source control system and your build processes that is very convenient, very easy to use. And if you like, I think, in some way we are very much a victim of the ease of use of Hudson, in that it is so easy to get it up and running, but that is not a secure environment. So again, in terms of looking at how we can make Hudson more suitable for enterprise development, as well as open source and work group development, this is an important aspect, right? And we get into difficult territory here because you don't want to raise barriers to people to using it. And quite often, if the very first thing they see when they install something is, right, start providing me with a key or with credentials before I'll even boot up, that can actually put people off. So it's kind of a delicate balancing match, and we'll have to just talk around this in the community as to what the effective approach will be. But it would be good to actually have the thing secure by default out of the box, because there's a lot of CI servers just sitting out there on the public internet. And when you think about what you can do from Hudson, let's create a shell script. That's incredibly dangerous. Yes. And I know, any kind of security review of an organization that's using this kind of tool if they haven't secured the Hudson instance, then they'll be in real trouble, right?
Yes. I mean, even if you're not going to use your Hudson for anything extraordinary, it's still a good idea to secure your Hudson. So I happened to talk to one of the security guy who told me about some of the security holes in Hudson. So I asked him, so how did you find that? He said, it's so easy. Just do a Google on the Hudson CI server and certain URL. You get hundreds and hundreds of instances. We are just sitting without any security. So even if you are having your own laptop, and if it is not, you're sure that nobody is going to use, still keep it secure. Because Hudson it's open the entire world to the people. They can do anything with simple script.
And this also highlights the fact we made earlier about moving artifacts off of the Hudson CI server. So even if you are, for example, and we should probably do this ourselves, if you are building artifacts for an open source project where you absolutely want people to have access to those artifacts, it doesn't mean they have to have access to the build machine to do it, right? So move, you have your public-facing website with all the security and all of the capabilities around that. Don't make Hudson serve that process as well, right?
Yeah. Okay. On the point of security, if you are a huge organization, and if you have a lot of teams using this Hudson, even though they have their own Hudson, the best practice is to set up your Hudson with an SSO. So that's what we are trying to do it in Oracle. So this gives much more secure, because those security what already set it up, the single sign-on may be much secure. So it's easy to set up Hudson on that within your firewall.
Yeah. And then it's also someone else's problem, which is even nicer. Because the last thing, someone running a work group Hudson server wants to do is to worry about creating credentials for everyone. If you can just hook up, someone else looks after the SSO system or the LDAP, that's absolutely great. Okay, so I think we've probably covered most of these. Again, just about, thinking about how the default environment is probably not the best environment. It's very easy to be running either on Windstone or Jetty, depending which version of Hudson you're on. But, let's think about actually where can I put this in terms of a more robust and secure application server? What can I put in front of it? As I said, maybe we'll move the artifacts even onto a different machine. Yeah. So, that's as much about scalability and management of the running Hudson as anything else. Because if you move into a more upscale app server like Glassfish, for example, then at least you can get a little bit more management control over what's happening inside that instance. Yeah.
The fronting your Hudson, whether it is running as a standalone or if it is running in another container like Glassfish or WebLogic or JBoss, it's always a better practice to have front it with a proxy server. Either it is an Apache or use an NG, Ning server for proxying. So as I said earlier, so don't use your Hudson instance as a artifact download. So keep it for downloads. So whenever a build is done, there are different plugins. One is a copy artifact plugin, RCP plugin, SCP plugin. You can use this plugin to copy your artifacts into that proxy server. That's, for example, Apache. So if somebody wants to download it, they download it directly from the Apache server, not from the Hudson. So that makes your Hudson to run faster, for execute faster, because you don't reserve any of its threads to serve the files for the people who are downloading the artifacts.
Okay, so again, back to this issue of designing your environment as a production environment. As I mentioned before, there's this tendency for the infrastructure of many Hudson users to just kind of evolve gently. I've got a spare laptop that no one uses anymore because it's no good for anything else, but it runs the CI server really well. We've got a whole bunch of machines in the lab that, we could use those, right? And you end up with these really heterogeneous, mixed grid of machines. And it's good because you can use those things. And in many ways, that's one of the attractions that you can make use of this obsolete hardware. But the downside there is that can really lead to a lot of issues with, or conflicts, if you like, with some of the other things we want to achieve, such as a good backup regime. and an environment that we can restore easily and quickly. And if you've got, one of your slaves running on Solaris, another one running on Red Hat, another one running on Windows, you've now got 3 environments to manage if you need to restore all of that, right? As well as making things like your script writing a little bit more difficult and so on. So if you're, quotes, designing an infrastructure, the way you need to look at it is, obviously, first of all, start simple. You do not need to buy a huge XE something box from Oracle to run your Hudson builds on, right? If you do, you're doing good work, but I somehow don't think you need to do that, right? We need much less infrastructure. So yes, start simple, but start thinking about, right, as I expand this up, as I want to add more nodes, more executors into the overall process, try and do that in a consistent way. Ideally, if you could just stamp out a VM image that provides that environment and just provides more resources for it, then you're going to be in a great position because your backup and restore policy is right there almost. Right? So having a consistent and simple approach to laying out the infrastructure is really key, right? And don't try and overdo it. And certainly get rid of the old pizza boxes under the desk.
Yeah. So private plugin site, I want to talk about that. So I heard from several teams there, especially the build engineers who is monitoring all this Hudson. They came and they told me that I'm maintaining about 5 to 6 Hudson instances, but what happens is these people, they just go and install any plugin and then they break the whole thing and they are coming back to me, and this is a painful problem for me. How do I make them to restrict to install only the certain plugins? So that's why we came up the idea about update site, which you can have exclusively, you can set it up, and then the Hudson can talk to that. Hudson already has a way to do that, but we tried to make it much more easier way. So now, okay, so we set up a new Hudson site, so how do I maintain the Hudson site? Is there any UI for me to do that? Yes, we came up with an idea called Plugin Central. So this is I forgot, can you show that?
Which one do you want?
HudsonCI.org/Plugin Central.
Okay.
So this Plugin Central is a full-fledged UI. It gives you a good way to monitor, update your own Hudson Update Center from outside of that. So the source code is available. You can just check it out and do it. You can install it in your own Plugin Central.
Plugin Central
3.
Yeah.
3.
Yeah. No.
No.
Am I missing a dash? Oh, we'll find out later. Yeah, that's all right. Yeah. On with the show, because we're getting short on time. Because I talk too much. It's always the way.
Yeah, mine is another.
Okay, just a few other things. We've kind of talked about some of this already, particularly the disk space one, which we've seen so many times, both within the organization at Oracle, where we've got hundreds of Hudson instances running, but also externally. So it's probably one of the most common issues we see from folks using it there. And as I say, just manage the environment. Ensure you've got identical JDK versions, so you're not going to get weirdness happening when I compile on one thing versus another thing, another build, another slave. I get different results. Why is that? Well, you've got different VMs. So the whole thing about maintaining consistent environments, it's kind of helping you to help yourselves, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's again another one important thing. A lot of times they say, oh, I built certain things, it is working on this slave, but it's not working on this slave. Then I say that, then after going through all the things, then I asked, oh, are you using the same JDK at both places? Then say, oh, no, here it is a JDK and there is some JDK 5.5 different version. And unless you are building your software for particular JDK on different slaves, try to keep the JDK and all those things uniform at all the different places. It's hard to maintain that manually. That's why I think the Puppet and other infrastructure maintenance tools are there. So these are all very simple things, but this goes a long way.
Yeah. So on to upgrades. Winston talked about this at length. I say it's a really dangerous area because we make it too easy. So you really want to be thinking about the upgrade process as a planned process. Right. Now, you know, from a code quality perspective, we've done a lot of work over the last few Hudson releases to make sure everything is well QA'd and it should upgrade fine, but that should is very dependent on the tests that we've run and the build jobs we're trying to upgrade. And as I said earlier, you know, people do weird stuff. They use weird plugins or they use old versions of plugins. All sorts of things can go wrong. So let's just be, you know, sensible about the whole upgrade process and protect ourselves by using a sandbox, testing it out first, and so on. Okay, so that's brilliant on timing because we're just about there. So I think the key takeaways here, you know, we're not talking about tremendously difficult things. To get real progress in you know, the effectiveness of your Hudson infrastructure and the way that it works is not a matter of writing better plugins or being cooler in the way how complex your jobs are or the way your jobs hang together. It's all about just treating the system like a grown-up system. It's a production infrastructure that is probably critical to your business or your project. Just think how much it's going to cost you in either grief, late nights, coffee, whatever, when you have to rebuild that thing from scratch. And then think, well, actually, am I approaching this in the right way? Plan your upgrades, manage the infrastructure, back it all up, keep things simple, and you'll actually be going a long way towards what we would call best practice.
Yeah.
So we'll just do a few thanks. So these are some of the folks who gave us a lot of help with this presentation, either through direct input and ideas to include, and I do thank them all. Some of them are here, but also the Eclipse Foundation themselves for letting us poke into their stack traces and heaps, and the JDK platform team as well.
Yeah.
So with that, we're just about on time.
Whatever we talked today, we learned from our users of Hudson. So if you have any trouble, just send me an email. Every day morning, first I see the emails and make sure to reply to all of them. Then only I start my coding. So don't hesitate to send email. I will reply.
Okay, well, thank you very much for attending. Bagels are waiting.